Hey, Jerry, were your rules all ordered? Did rules go with you on that? Because you were very convincing last night. He did a great job for you. Good morning. The committee will come to order. We on the Oversight Committee exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers. Because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government, we have a responsibility to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we are at the core of our responsibility. President Obama recently unveiled or announced in the State of the Union a reorganization plan. His request for authority comes without any specifics, simply the need for reorganization. Although we recognize that there may be a specific plan that the President can work with us on, I believe this committee has an obligation to go far beyond what the President has in mind. In fact, under both this President and his predecessor, OMB has told us that Congress won't, in fact, be necessary, that we can do it with limited authority. That's simply not true. The history has shown since the Hoover Commission that the only way to get genuine change in the Federal bureaucracy is to have buy-in in advance from the House, the Senate, the community at large, and the executive branch. Reorganizations, like the first major reorganization, require multi-term occurrences. Congress's change, the House and the Senate changes significantly, and the White House is likely to change who is in it, not because this President may not win re-election, but because reorganization takes more than 4 or 5 years. A good plan is in fact a plan for at least a decade, and one that takes years to accomplish. Just bringing together disparate databases that in fact have grown up over a generation into a single, cohesive, interactive system would easily take 2 presidencies. So as we begin today talking about waste in government anew, let's understand that since 2008, spending on Federal programs has increased by hundreds of billions of dollars. We simply cannot reshuffle the deck chairs on this Titanic. The truth is that uncollected debts total over $290 billion. Improper payments total at least $115 billion in 2011. The Federal government has grown its workforce by 200,000 employees. Last year, the duplicative programs reported by the GIO identified numerous areas that overlap, and in fact, none have changed during the interim. It's very clear that the Administration is on the right track by saying that we need a major reorganization. But this committee, more than any other committee in the House, has an obligation to look at the big picture. We have to look at last week's, Sunday's announcement of the new budget, which will add $1.3 trillion to the deficit. Clearly, we cannot tax our way out of it, and we cannot cut our way out of it. Reorganization that brings efficiency, in other words, win-win, situations in which you make changes in which all the essential services get delivered, but they get delivered for less. Additionally, Every Congress we talk about how much is not collected, and yet we haven't made the fundamental investments into making sure that next year and the year after, collections are more and more honest because of the kind of transparency that real reform in database and in cooperation between Cabinet positions can bring. That's why I'm excited to have not one, but two Senators as our lead panel. And before we go to them, I now recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to welcome all of our distinguished witnesses here today. And let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for agreeing to my request to invite Senator Warner, who's been a champion of government reform efforts for many years, both as Governor of Virginia and now as the head of the Senate Budget Committee's Task Force on Government Performance. I would also like to thank the Chairman for agreeing to my request to invite our witness on the second panel, Max Stier, the President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, which issued a very good report on government efficiency issues last year. Now on the topic of today's hearing, I confess I am a bit confused. The hearing title suggests that the Federal Government has an obesity problem that somehow caused the nation's budget deficit. But according to economists and financial experts, the most significant causes of the federal deficit are: 1, the Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthy; 2, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan; and 3, the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. Unfortunately, we will not be addressing any of these issues today. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an excellent Washington Post column published yesterday titled, "Government Continues to Shrink Despite Obesity Problem Rhetoric."
Since it's excellent, without objection, so ordered.
So happened to be by Joe Davidson, who did a great job. The column addresses today's hearing and describes how the size of the federal workforce has decreased and the government is doing more with less. The hearing title also refers to a recent proposal by the President to reorganize and consolidate a number of our nation's trade agencies into a single department that will be more effective and save billions of dollars in the process. Unfortunately, we will not be addressing the details of this proposal today either. Instead, today's hearing appears to be a survey of proposals to reduce the size of government and cut the pay and benefits of federal employees without focusing on the negative impacts of these proposals on core services that the American people depend upon. I think it is safe to say that every member of the committee and this Congress agrees that the federal government can and should work better. We should always strive to ensure that agencies work more effectively and efficiently on behalf of the American taxpayers. Our differences come in figuring out how we get there. I do not believe that the way to reform government is to attack millions of hardworking, middle-class workers who are already contributing $60 billion towards deficit reduction as a result of the existing 2-year pay freeze. Yet, the House is scheduled to vote this week on a bill approved by this committee that would take an additional $44 billion out of their pockets by slashing existing pension benefits for new, current, and retiring federal workers. This is the wrong approach. We should not try to solve our budget problems on the backs of middle-class federal workers while we refuse to ask the wealthiest Americans, refuse to ask them to contribute even 1 penny more towards these goals. Instead, we should reform government by cutting waste. For example, there are billions of dollars waiting to be saved through contracting reform. The Commission on Wartime Contracting identified between $31 billion and $60 billion in waste in United States contingency contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Congressman Tierney, to his credit, has introduced a bill to enact one of the Commission's recommendations by creating a Special Inspector General for overseas contingency operations. Congress should also promote greater competition in Federal contracts. Federal agencies awarded about $170 billion in non-competitive contracts in 2009 alone. The administration is also taking a number of actions, such as improving agency systems to reduce improper payments by the federal government by $50 billion by the end of the year. One key tool that we already have in place is the GPRA Modernization Act. On the House side, this new law came out of this committee, and it was signed by President Obama on January 4th, 2011. It requires the administration to develop cost-cutting agency priority goals and to track progress toward meeting those goals. Finally, I know that Senator Warner was one of the biggest proponents of this law on the Senate side, and I understand he has been pressing the administration to fulfill each and every provision of the new law. I look forward to hearing his testimony, as well as that of Senator Johnson and all of our witnesses here today. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Would you yield to the gentleman from Virginia for a moment?
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member. I just wanted to, of course, welcome both of our senators, but I particularly wanted to welcome my home state senator, soon to be the senior senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mark Warner. Senator Warner and I worked together when he was the governor, and I was chairman of Fairfax County, and now we have the privilege of both serving our constituents here in the Congress. And I want to thank him for his leadership, his willingness to try to find bipartisan solutions, his leadership on trying to find creative solutions to our fiscal problems, and of course his championship for the federal workforce, where the Commonwealth of Virginia hosts so many federal employees. So just wanted to welcome him to the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now go to our distinguished panel of witnesses. Whether junior or senior senator, you're still distinguished. Senator Mark Warner represents the Commonwealth of Virginia, and of course, Senator Johnson representing the state of Wisconsin. If you were not members of our body, you would be required to be sworn pursuant to the committee rules. Since all of us on both sides of the dais at this time are sworn officials, we would like to hear your testimony. Since you're senators, we have to tell you that we do have this clock. It runs for 5 minutes, and it means not that much, but try to summarize as close as you can to 5 minutes. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings, for inviting me today. It's and members of the committee. I'm proud to be here with my good friend Ron Johnson. I want to make sure the record shows that both Senator Johnson and I were here at the committee on time, and you know, as the chairman mentioned a little bit earlier, we will, since we are both fairly junior in the Senate, we will soon get over this this affliction and start treating you House members as opposed to just new senators. So, but we really look forward to the opportunity to be here and discuss the way government works. I also want to thank the chairman for the collaboration we've had on the data bill, something I think that's very important in terms of bringing across the board financial transparency to government operations, and I look forward to seeing if we can get that passed into law. I want to echo what the ranking member said. I looked at the title for the hearing today, and I had to think it was a colorful title. I'm not sure that our government is obese, but I sure had to believe that it could use a bit of housekeeping.
Senator, it's kind of like when you have a really good article, but the headline is different. Two different groups write them.
I get it. I get it. You know, I think we would all agree, though, that for too long we have added programs, regulations, and policies layer after layer without ever taking time to step back and review the structure of government to see if these existing programs and policies really make sense. And this is something that Senator Johnson and I have worked on the Budget Committee together, and I know it's the function of this committee. I've got a lot of ideas, and recognizing the time and constraints, I want to try to hit these very quickly. Would love to have the opportunity to come back and share in more detail any of the subjects that I'm going to briefly discuss. And I do think that, as Ranking Member Cummings said, that in a number of these areas, President Obama has made progress. Let's start with the overlap and duplication of federal programs. I recall as a governor how frustrating it was for me when we looked at things like workforce training, when we looked at teacher quality programs, trying to rationalize them at the state level was virtually impossible because we had so many different Federal programs with different streams of funding. We should not have 82 teacher quality programs across 10 different agencies. We shouldn't have 56 financial literacy programs across 20 different agencies. I do believe that reorganization and consolidation of similar and duplicative programs can provide more effective services and at the same time save taxpayer monies. There's a couple of different ways we can go about this. Ranking Member Cummings mentioned the littlest bill that probably most folks have never heard of other than members of this committee, the GPRA bill, the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act of 2010, which I was proud to co-sponsor. One of the requirements of that bill was to try to limit the number of goals an actual agency has. Because anybody who's been in business knows that if you have 10, 20, 30 goals, you really have no major goal. Unless we can limit this to a more limited number and start looking across the function of government, not just by program and by agency, we're not going to be effective. On Monday, when the President outlined his budget, he outlined 14 cross-agency priority goals in the 2013 budget. As I mentioned previously, there was no requirement. This was one of the requirements of GPRA. The 14 goals, I think, that the President outlined were clear. One, for example, was the goal to double exports by the end of 2014. That is clearly in the nation's interest and cuts across a series of agencies. So I think we are seeing some of the results of GPRA already. I would argue as well one area that the administration, I think, needs to do better on. We asked in GPRA for agencies not only to identify their top programs, but to do something that has never been done before, which is identify their least performing programs. We too often in government want to highlight our successes. We're not as willing to expose those areas that need improvement, and we need to continue to focus the administration on performance of least performing programs. But obviously we continue to do more. The President has also requested that we restore executive reorganization authority with expedited congressional review. And again, there would be a process for Congress to review any proposed reorganization. I urge the committee to consider this proposal favorably. As the Chair and the Ranking Member knows, I spent most of my career in business, and every CEO has the authority to reorganize and restructure their company to improve results. As Governor, I had the authority to reorganize the state agencies, and I was also held accountable for results. In fact, every president from 1932 to 1984 had the authority to submit proposals to reorganize the executive branch. I believe we should give the President, as our chief executive, the authority to do this job and modernize the way government works to deliver better results and, again, hold the President accountable. I think one of the things that we can include in this type of proposal is to make sure that any reorganization would actually save money and eliminate overhead. And I would also point out again that what the President is proposing would still give Congress the ability to vote on an up or down basis on any specific reorganization. I intend to be a sponsor of the President's Reforming and Consolidating Government Act of 2012 in the Senate, and I can assure you that there will be broad bipartisan support in the Senate, and I hope, again, that same kind of support can be garnered here in the House. And I would argue, since this bill is coming so late in the President's term, this would obviously be a tool, whoever becomes the next President serving in January of 2013. Another area I believe we need to do more housekeeping on is regulations, and I know the committee, again, has worked on this as well. I believe regulations are like programs. We've added layers and layers over the years, but we rarely go back and review what works. We need regulatory reform to put in place basic metrics and incentives to provide some regulatory housekeeping. I'm working on a proposal that will require all agencies, executive and independent, to conduct economic impact analysis for all those proposed regulations costing over $100 million. I've also got a proposal that would build on this, that would try to change some of the incentives inside the agencies. Right now, an agency is basically rewarded with more personnel and more funding if you add more regulations. We've got to try to change that framework. So my regulatory reform proposal will also include a pay-go-type mechanism that will require agencies to identify offsets that will force them to modify or eliminate rules from their existing stock of regulations whenever they seek to put new regulations in place. This kind of balancing out aspect will actually, I believe, change the incentives inside the agency so that as they move forward on proposed appropriate new regulations, you have to find that offset. It makes, I think, good common sense, and before you say this would be impossible to do, the UK has actually implemented a similar system called the one-in, one-out proposal. It's been up and operating for a couple of years right now, and again, we're modeling after some of the very effective things that have taken place in regulatory reform in the UK. In addition, as we've looked at regulatory reform, I've seen that one of the things we don't do a very good job of is ever looking back and seeing, did the regulation that was put in place actually achieve its goal? It's remarkable. We've never done this in any meaningful way. And what we have instead is we have sometimes agencies saying, here are all these benefits, businesses saying, here are all these costs. We don't have some level of independent analysis on this. I believe we need a legislative agency like the CVO to review the economic impact analysis every 5 years or so to determine if the regulations that we have put in place, or the agencies have put in place, are working, and report this information to Congress. This independent analysis will provide helpful data for Congress and the agencies to modify and eliminate both outdated laws and regulations. In closing, let me just say this. We do have a lot of work to do. I did see recently that the President identified 9,000 reports that agencies submit to Congress. If there was one, again, low-hanging fruit that we could relieve some burden on the agencies, but also start to streamline some of this duplicative reporting systems also need to be reviewed. I do think it is the responsibility for Congress to think boldly in this area. We've also got a proposal we're working on, a civilian BRAC process in terms of real property, something that if we're looking at our enormous deficits, we ought to put in the hopper as well. So I'd love to come back at some point, recognizing I've well exceeded my 5 minutes here, as any good senator would. But I look forward to working with this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before it. And I want to again say Senator Johnson, while he is a new senator, has taken up this mantle as well. And he is a great colleague and someone I know will be a firm ally of this committee in terms of making government more efficient for our people, our taxpayers, and at the end of the day, saving some dollars. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator Johnson, even though he's got you by a year and a half, more or less you can have the same time. Please, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. We are entering the 4th year of an administration that promised to cut the deficit in half by the end of its first term. The U.S. incurred a deficit of $459 billion in 2008, the year before President Obama entered office. Yet the deficit grew to $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2009, followed by $1.3 trillion in 2010, $1.3 trillion in 2011, and OMB has just projected another deficit of $1.3 trillion in 2012. And as a quick aside, contrary to popular belief, the total cost of the 2001-2003 tax cuts plus the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, approximately $300 billion when our annual deficit is $1.3 trillion, or $1,300 billion. So that is not the main driver of our deficit. Any proposal to consolidate operations that would actually reduce spending would be welcome and should be enacted. And here's where I'd like to commend Senator Warner as being a real leader in the Senate. And it's a real area, I think, where we can work on a bipartisan basis to obtain reform and enact reform in government. So I certainly look forward to working with you on that. But when placed in proper perspective to the magnitude of our budget and regulatory crisis, President Obama's requested fast-track reorganization authority looks more like an election year talking point than a serious cost-cutting proposal. Why should the American people take this proposal seriously when President Obama's fiscal 2013 budget adds $10.6 trillion to our current debt level and proposes spending another $47 trillion over the next 10 years? By the way, this compares to his budget from last year the proposed spending $46 trillion over 10 years. Where are the spending cuts? The federal government is obese. For 50 years, from 1960 through 2008, federal spending averaged 20.2% of GDP. Last year, it exceeded 24%. And without reform, it will consume 35% of our economy by the year 2035. As Federal Reserve Board Chairman Bernanke stated in testimony before the Senate Budget Committee last week, this dynamic is clearly unsustainable. Federal spending is the visible portion of government fat. Federal regulations are the less visible plaque clogging the arteries of our economy. According to a study commissioned by the Small Business Administration, it cost $1.75 trillion to comply with federal regulations in 2008. That amount is larger than all but 8 economies in the world and is a burden imposed by Washington on job creators each and every year. Reshuffling agencies, akin to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, will do little to slow the out-of-control growth of the federal government. Instead of saving costs, consolidation efforts could take on a life of their own. For example, while the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is a worthy one, no one knows if the cost of consolidating 22 agencies has been worth the price tag. A 2011 study by Ohio State University estimates the total cost to the economy of Homeland Security measures tops $1 trillion. With more than 230,000 employees, DHS is now the third largest cabinet department. Yet, an unqualified audit of its operations remains elusive and unfulfilled. And let's face it, the federal government is replete with unfulfilled promises. Our $16 trillion war on poverty is impoverishing America. In 1965, 0.3% of the population, 561,000 individuals, received food stamps. Today, that number has increased to 46 million, or 14.8% of all Americans. During the same period, the percentage of families living below the poverty line has only slightly declined, from 13.9% to 11.1%. But the absolute number of individuals in poverty has almost doubled, from 24 million to over 46 million. Partly as a result of government programs making out-of-wedlock births financially possible, those birth rates have skyrocketed from 7.7% in 1965 to 40.6% last year, with obvious negative economic implications for those families and federal, state, and local budgets. These are not metrics of success. They are profoundly disappointing metrics of abject failure. As someone new to this process, it is apparent that Washington's bias is geared for addition and rarely subtraction. Last year proved the current political makeup of Washington does not possess the courage or will to adequately limit the growth of government. Enforceable spending controls, like the CAP Act and a constitutional amendment to limit the size of government, must first be passed to force everyone to negotiate spending priorities and entitlement reform. Everyone should be at the table, and everything should be put back on budget, subject to annual appropriations and 75-year solvency standards. To address the growing regulatory burden on job creators, a regulation moratorium should be put in place until measures like the United Kingdom's one-in, one-out rule and the REINS Act can be enacted to achieve regulatory balance. And finally, a bicameral sunset committee should be established with the sole mandate of identifying federal rules, regulations, and laws that do more harm than good, and then recommending their elimination. In a government where most activities are additive, a permanent sunset committee would provide a formalized process for subtraction. That would be a welcome change. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself if you'll take some questions. Senator Warner, that distinguished document, the very good document that was entered in the record by the ranking member, talks about the size of the Federal workforce, and it takes full advantage of 1 million men and women who were taken out of the military during the era of shrinking that they mentioned. Do you think that the size of the Federal workforce in number of employees is the appropriate measure, or do you believe that when we're looking at the size of government, we should use Senator Johnson's metrics, which is the portion of the GDP that is consumed by government?
I would first of all point out I've used those same numbers on the
well, I knew you'd go with this, so that's why I'm asking.
The amount of consumption of Federal government at 24–25%. Of course, I also point out the fact that revenues now are 15% of a 75-year low, and any time we've had, as somebody who's been more than slightly obsessed about the $15 trillion debt and deficit, if you look back over those 75 years, any time we've had relative balance has been when spending and revenues have been between that 19.5% and 21%. So I want to get in the point that if we're going to get a deficit solution, it is going to require both a shrinking and an increase on revenue size. I think in terms of the size of the Federal workforce, what is the exact right number for the workforce, I think is what is the least number possible to provide efficient service. As we were talking in the anteroom, the size of the Federal workforce right now is a bit of a mystery because are we counting full-time employers? Are we counting contractors? And those numbers, the fact that we don't have frankly, as good a data on the size, the fact that we don't know, for example, the exact number of contractors that DOD has at this point, this is one area I completely agree with Senator Johnson. We ought to have at least full and complete data so then we can have this kind of discussion.
Well, and I think that's the leading question I asked. Senator Johnson, we often debate how much we pay a Federal worker, whether we outsource or insource. To a great extent, those questions are to be a question of cost versus benefit. I think we'd all agree to that. You said, quite candidly, that, well, look, we've got this 24% that could and will likely grow to 35% if unchecked. We have a historic 19%. Senator Warner points out that we, in fact, have 15% coming out of revenue. Do you agree that we need to get, our goal should be to get to 1919, so to speak, that we can't expect to get to 19% of GDP in spending and still have 15% in revenue and then say we have a balanced budget? Would you agree to that?
Well, first of all, I think you have to recognize reality, and over the last 50 years prior to 2008, the total amount the Federal government was able to extract from the economy in revenue was about 18.1%. And that's regardless of whether the top personal tax rate during my lifetime has been 90, 70, 50, 28, 30, 31, 35, 39.6%. So to a certain extent, you have to recognize reality. Now, I realize that when we had surpluses for 4 years, the end of the 90s, early 2000s, revenue did bump up against above 20% 1 year, otherwise still below 20, but spending was only at 19.1% one of those years, otherwise it was in the 18% range. So from my standpoint, I think the size of government in relation to GDP is a key metric. And when you currently add in state and local spending, we're at about 40% nationally. So 40 cents of every dollar filters through some level of government. And to put that in perspective, Norway spends 40% on government of its GDP. Greece, anybody hear of Greece recently, is about 47%. Italy's 49%.
A little difference in how much they get from oil between Greece where they have olive oil, Norway where they have export oil that's much more profitable.
Precisely. But right now in the United States, we are at the lower level of European-style government. And we're seeing that economic model collapse. And it's just not a metric for success. And again, I think we should really be looking at metrics. Certainly everything the government does needs to be judged based on what it actually accomplishes, and the metrics of success are not really there.
Well, let me quickly, because my time is expiring and I know you have very short time here. The President has talked about reorganization authority, and you may differ on this, but let me ask sort of the rhetorical question. In the best case, because you both alluded to this, wouldn't we plan a reorg authority in the House and the Senate that envisions if you will, continuous reform. Envisions the idea that reform is not an up or down vote one time on a change that the President thinks works for one or more agencies, but in fact change the whole system to be more corporate. And I'll preface this by saying, Senator Warner, you and I would agree on almost everything, but I've been a CEO and I've been a board member. CEOs do not have straight reorg authority. What they ordinarily do is they bring their ideas to the board and they get sort of a pre-approval. Then they go out and they refine it, and then they come back for a final approval. And during this time, they periodically come for major chunks of money. And, oh, by the way, the CFO tries to figure out how to explain it to Wall Street. So when we look at the process of government, one of the challenges is, and this is where I want you both to comment as much as you feel you can, don't we inherently have a problem considering reorg authority up or down one time, and shouldn't we fashion our bills so that there is ongoing commission, both House and Senate, but also independent thinkers, working in concert with whoever's in the White House to try to get continuous improvement?
Well, I would agree, Mr. Chairman, that we need to have a process that has continuous improvement, number one. Number two, I think on any reorg authority, that a requirement that said you have to show that the reorganization would save costs and save overhead would be important. Number three, what the President is requesting would be then subject to an up or down vote. And I would concur with you that most CEOs would have to then go to their board and get approval. The one difference that I would point out, and I didn't fully appreciate this until I got here, was that in the case of a business operation, generally speaking, the board of a company has the best interest almost always of the company at heart. One of the things that's been interesting as we come up here, and I could never understand why we didn't have a rational, for example, transportation policy at the Federal level. Now, having been here for 3 years, I understand that it is because of congressional jurisdiction turf battles that mean that I'm not sure, and I say this in an ecumenical fashion, that too often rationalization of the Federal Government is held up by the congressional oversight and congressional jurisdiction function that has no equivalent in the private sector. So giving this President, giving any President the reorg ability with a straight up or down, with a requirement that you've got to show cost effectiveness and overhead savings, I think is just a rational way to move forward on an entity as large as the Federal Government.
Okay, before we go to Senator Johnson, I would ask unanimous consent that a small but meaningful list of the 108 committees and subcommittees the Department of Homeland Security alone reports to in our turf battles be entered in the record as germane. Without objection, so ordered. Senator Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to recognize that what motivates business and what motivates bureaucracies are two totally different things. I mean, business actually has the discipline of making a profit, so they have every incentive to keep their expenses and costs in line. Bureaucracies, on the other hand, their primary goal, in many respects, is growth. They continue to grow. And so if we're going to think about reorganizing bureaucracies, any successful business, of course, does have a culture of continuous improvement. And the way they're able to maintain that culture of continuous improvement is they actually benchmark goals and they measure what goals they've established. And that's part of the problem in government is we just simply never really go back and take a look at what were the good intentions and measure what actually was achieved versus what the intention was. And that was what I was trying to point out in my testimony. That's where it starts. We have to establish the goals and the metrics for, accountability.
If I could just add one comment, and I'm not sure we're all that far apart. Your concept of continuing.
Well, this is what we like about having the two of you is that for this committee, I think there's no two senators closer to the view that where we need to be.
But I do think we have put in place some tools. I do think GIPRA, which requires a consolidation of a few identifiable goals for each program or agency, is a critical first step. I think the notion of cross-cutting agency goals so that as you have these, 47 different financial literacy programs and 92 teacher training programs, not only do you need consolidation, but you need amongst those what are the top couple of goals around teacher quality and improvement. I do think the notion of regulatory reform, a one-in, one-out regulatory pay-go makes sense in terms of housekeeping approach, so that there is a incentive inside the agency to look at cleaning out. I also think the notion, particularly on the regulatory front, of creating someplace, and CBO may or may not be the best spot, an independent entity that can assess the claim oftentimes made by the agency that X thousands of lives are saved, or the cost by the business that X hundreds of billions of dollars are charged. We have no independent analysis there. And we have no analysis that says 3 years, 5 years after the fact, did the regulation that was put in place actually achieve the goal that was said to put in place? These kind of areas, I think, would help bring about some of the objective metrics that I think all of us would like to see if we're going to hold government more accountable, and recognizing as we have to take on this $15 trillion debt, clearly we've got to spend smarter than we're spending now.
Thank you. With that, we go to the gentleman from Virginia who was here at the start for his questions.
I thank the Chair. And again, welcome both of our colleagues from the United States Senate. Just a few questions to my friend and colleague, Senator Warner. Senator Warner, if I understood what you were saying in terms of metrics, surely looking at spending, federal spending as a percentage of GDP is absolutely a valid metric. But if I heard you correctly, so too is revenue as a percentage of GDP. And right now, that revenue figure is far below what it was last time we actually balanced the federal budget without a constitutional amendment 4 years in a row. Is that correct?
I think, again, as my friend, the Congressman, is aware, have been very active in the efforts to try to bring about this balance, cutting spending, reforming entitlement programs, a tax reform program that generates additional revenue, because I frankly believe the debt and deficits is our single greatest threat to this country, and in effect has become a proxy for whether Congress is up to solving any problem. And it's going to require, I think, looking at both sides of the balance sheet.
And Senator, when you were the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, you had to balance the budget 4 years of your term. Did you only look at cutting spending to balance that budget?
Thank you, Congressman, for that very nice, easy softball you've just thrown me. You may recall Virginia was dealing with a $6 billion budget shortfall. We were put for the first time ever on credit watch. We substantially cut programs, shrank our state workforce, but we also put together a tax reform plan with a 2-to-1 Republican legislature that passed with significant numbers, and Virginia was reaffirmed not only its AAA bond rating, ranking for the best managed state in the country, and I would add ranked as the best state for business.
So balance worked out pretty well for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Balance worked out pretty well. I would also add one of the challenges we have, and I think this is again needs to be reflected as we look at what is the appropriate percent of federal spending in the GDP, is that, and again, it would be an area where actually I think Senator Johnson and I would agree. We might disagree about the specifics of the reform, but we do need to reform our entitlement programs. One of the challenges we have is we have 3 million people a year hit retirement age. Whatever that retirement age ends up being, there are going to be costs in those programs that are in effect unprecedented, always keeping upward pressure on the amount of spend the federal government will have. So this is just demographics taking place, and how we grapple with that is terribly important.
And Senator Warner, again, looking at metrics, certainly I remember both in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in local government, one metric we used was the ratio of our staffing to population. We used that to see, were we in fact efficiently using technology to create economies for our taxpayers. And I'm just looking at data over the last 50 years. In 1962, when President Kennedy was president, the ratio was 13.3. That is to say, 13.3 employees per 1,000 population. And it went up under Nixon from that to 14.4, which was the high water mark, and it is now the lowest it's been in 50 years, 8.4. And if you look at actual numbers, including Postal Service workers, actual numbers of federal employees, it's 350,000 below its high water mark 20 years ago when President H.W. Bush was president. So in absolute terms and in ratio, it looks like in the last 50 years we've actually cut out a lot of that fat we're so concerned about in the title of this hearing. Do you think it's a fair metric to suggest that that kind of ratio might mean we are running a leaner and more efficient operation, not to suggest there couldn't be additional savings, but clearly we've achieved something here?
I have to say that I'm just going to say that this is in the Senate when we make these quick testimonies, we speak and then get out of Dodge before the questions come. It is interesting sitting on this side of the ledger following a thoughtful, provocative, but very leading question. But I think that is I think those are good metrics you've put forward.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you very much for being with us.
Senator Johnson, I think you had something left to say.
I'd like to provide some balance to the question.
I apologize to the chair. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I apologize, and we're going to let you go. I felt that that you're both sort of Fox, not MSNBC, but Senator Johnson felt left out here, and he's junior, and I don't want him to leave here feeling bad.
Okay, no, I just want to provide a little balance in answering the question. First of all, I think there's a great deal of agreement, certainly what I found, I would say consensus in Washington, that we actually need to reform our tax code. And I think Republicans also want more revenue, but we want to grow revenue the old-fashioned way by increasing our economy. And so the question I would ask, when you take a look at the metric of 24% of GDP in terms of government spending, is why hasn't this President in his budget actually proposed pro-growth tax reform? And also, we all recognize that the real long-term looming crisis in terms of our budget is entitlements, Medicare and Social Security. And again, the President, in his fourth budget, he's basically had four cracks at the apple here. He still has yet to step up the plate and propose any type of reform that would actually save Social Security and Medicare long term. So again, I'm all for increasing revenue, but let's do it the old-fashioned way by actually getting economic growth. The reason we're at only 15% revenue this year and for the last couple of years is because our economy is in terrible shape. And that's also, to a certain extent, driven by the progressivity of our tax code. When you have a highly progressive tax code, it's going to be revenue in terms of the government is going to be far more affected by shocks to the economy. So again, I would look at pro-growth tax reform that broadens the base, eliminates the loopholes and special deductions. I think there's a great deal of consensus, and that's what we really need to be doing here is let's look at what we agree on. We agree on reforming government. We agree on pro-growth tax reform, so let's actually start doing it this year.
I want to thank both of you. Please tell your friends on the other side of the dome. It's a great place to come, a great audience, another opportunity for a C-SPAN moment. So we'll take a short recess just to reset, and thank you again, Senators.
I can't hear you. He came across as reasonable here.
I see 3. I'd like to see 4. Thank you. Committee will come to order. Our second panel of witnesses includes Mr. Paul Light, as a professor of public service at the Robert Wagner School of Public Service, New York University. The Honorable Dan Blair serves as President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. Mr. Robert Shea is a principal at Grant Thornton, LLP, and Mr. Max Steyer is President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service. You're not senators. Pursuant to the rules of the committee, all witnesses will be sworn. Please rise to take the oath and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Since there's a few more of you, we would ask that you try to stay close to your 5 minutes. As previously noted, your entire statement will be placed in the record along with supplemental data you may choose to add after the hearing. So let's begin with Dr. Light.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you for your work and the committee's work to improve government performance. I'd like to start by just telling you a quick story about Senator John Glenn, for whom I had the pleasure of serving back in the 100th Congress on government reform and presidential appointments. I remember asking him once what he was thinking when he was sitting on top of the rocket that would send him into orbit, now almost 50 years ago. Were you thinking about whether the rocket was fueled and whether everybody was ready, whether there might be an accident? And he said back to me, of course not. I was thinking about the lawn, my house, Annie, you know, the whole thing. And I said, why? And he said, because I had faith that the federal employees and the contractors working side by side with them were doing their job. And I wonder sometimes whether he would have that same level of confidence given the ongoing problems actually delivering services now 50 years later. I still think he would have great confidence, but I think we've got to ask ourselves the question about whether government is currently working as well as it should. I want to answer.
And this was even though every other launch, every second launch prior to that had blown up?
He was very.
He was an optimist, wasn't he?
And he still is. He still is. We should all be in his shape, you know. I just want to answer a couple of questions that came up earlier. You have my statement. On the overhaul issue, you're quite right. There were 2 Hoover commissions. One ran from 47 to 49, the other from 53 to 55. They produced 50 reorganization plans. It was not a single up or down. Now, they did have the reorganization authority, and of course the President's asking for consolidation authority, and we can talk a little bit about that. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I'm not sure where the reorganization plans would come from, given the shrinking of OMB's ability to deliver reorganization plans. So, you know, it's worth asking about. On the size of government headcount issue, I think you got to include all the federal government's employees, including contractors, and by my estimates, we've got about 7.5 million contract employees, another 3 million grant employees, and then we've got the 2.2 million federal employees, plus postal, plus military. It's a big workforce to deliver the mission we have. You know, so I think the issue of headcount is deceiving to some extent. I think we could have the same headcount but different distribution of workers and get the job done well. On the agenda, I think GPRA modernization is very important. I'd like to see a budget table that shows the amount of money that we spend on the priorities that are generated through the Modernization Act and see whether they add up to the total budget or what percentage of the budget cannot be classified as related to the small handle of priorities identified through this important process. On the thickening of government, really, what does a government agency look like? I think that you're on point here regarding the need for a more efficient government. I think we've got too many layers of government, too many presidential appointees. We could cut the number of presidential appointees in half and do better. I think the baby boom retirements, while troublesome to many of us, also offer an opportunity to take a good hard look at the senior levels of government, where I think we could have some downsizing and redistribution of workers down to the bottom. You have a bill before you that's been passed by the Senate on some modest streamlining, a small first step, really, by my view, and Max Stier here will argue that it's an important first step. I think we can move forward with it, but I still think we've got too many appointees and we ought to do something about it. Let me conclude by saying that my father was an auto parts man, and in his business was a machine shop, and he ground down pistons and engines and overhauled day in and day out. So when the President says we need an overhaul, I think of pulling the engine out, grinding it down, and really working it over, not just changing the spark plugs. And I think to date we have had relatively timid proposals for an overhaul, and it's time to get big. I don't necessarily know exactly how to do it. I've got some ideas, and I've got a list of proposals, but I think this committee, with its proud history, should be the place to begin this effort. So good luck, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate the invitation.
Could you pull the microphone just a little closer, please?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation for me to testify today. I'm Dan Blair, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. The Academy is a congressionally chartered nonprofit organization comprised of more than 700 fellows who are selected by the membership. I'm honored to appear on this panel today with three of my distinguished Academy fellows, Dr. Light, Mr. Shea, and Mr. Stier. And I would also note that Mr. Shea is the Vice Chairman of the Board, so I will be on good behavior today.
But are we all paying our dues?
Well, that's the better question, and we'll talk about that after the hearing, Dr. Light. As noted in my written testimony, the Academy's congressional charter precludes the organization from taking an official position on legislation, and the views I'm presenting today have not been formally endorsed by the Academy. We now use a 20th century government organization to respond to 21st century problems. The President's proposal to merge the Commerce Department with other trade-related agencies might be a step in the right direction, if done right. However, moving the boxes around without taking a hard look at how the actual work is being done is unlikely to lead to significant improvements. Organizational changes must be bolstered by additional approaches to improve public management. First, consider using the principles of smart lean government to examine the delivery of government programs and services through a holistic or cross-government approach. An SLG examination of government programs would take an enterprise architecture approach of examining the interrelationships of information, people, technology, and processes. For example, the trade promotion activities would not focus solely on the International Trade Administration, but would examine trade promotion activities and expenditures across the spectrum of agencies supporting foreign trade. This approach can identify areas where coordination can be improved and government activities may be consolidated and improve how programs are operated, measured, and managed. Other approaches include improving productivity and expanding the use of technology and data. A term called disruptive innovation, which is the introduction of new technology which replaces an earlier technology or product, can be utilized for the benefit of government and the taxpayer. Across the government, Congress and the Executive should foster environments that encourage innovation and creativity. For example, Congress could require the agencies report on their use of data accumulated from industry, other agencies, and the public in order to make it accessible and useful to its stakeholders. In the private sector, where disruptive innovation has become commonplace, consumers are used to steady price reductions and performance improvements over time. The challenge is creating management structures and environments which foster and encourage this type of behavior in government. Further, what gets measured is what gets done. So one step forward may be for the Bureau of Labor Statistics to begin again to measure Federal productivity. Federal government last measured its productivity almost 20 years ago, and it may be time to revisit that concept to determine what the appropriate productivity metrics would be to measure. Other tools include enhanced human capital flexibilities, increased interagency and intergovernmental collaboration and coordination, and linking budgets with program performance across agency and department lines. The GPRA Modernization Act gives OMB this type of authority to change the way budgets are developed and implemented. Further, Congress could consider engaging in a rigorous review of agency missions, functions, and programs in an effort at a strategic realignment. This approach would examine what agencies do as required by statute, regulation, or practice, and evaluate whether underperforming activities or programs should be shed in order to protect budgets for core mission and high-performing activities and programs. Mr. Chairman, by changing the way that government work gets done, we can dramatically improve the effectiveness and efficiency of government services and programs. This concludes my oral testimony. I am happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm proud to be with you today to talk about reorganization, especially at the committee that gave me my first job in Washington. I'm also proud to be with such good friends. You'll get, like on the last panel, a lot of violent agreement among us. My name is Robert Shea. I'm a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and a principal of Grant Thornton. Reorganization and consolidation offer many opportunities to improve government's performance, but they take time. Faster results, in my view, will come from greater collaboration among government programs and a more focused assessment of their relative cost effectiveness. And the Federal Government, as has been discussed, has been grappling with reorganization almost since its inception. But I wonder what past presidents would say about the volume of overlap and duplication that plagues our government today. There are hundreds of government programs, many aimed at the same problem, often from different organizations throughout the executive branch. If Congress or the executive branch were to undertake a substantial reorganization, where would they start? How would we know which programs to keep, consolidate, or terminate? Past efforts have made a dent, but really haven't provided you the information you need to make good decisions. After a decade of the Government Performance and Results Act implementation, many agencies began to make great strides understanding the performance of their programs. Unfortunately, that effort did not result in the kind of information you need to make decisions, like good cross-cutting goals or collaboration among cross-cutting programs. In 2001, OMB developed the Program Assessment Rating Tool to inventory the government's programs and assess their relative performance. After 5 years of implementation, OMB and agencies assessed nearly 1,000 programs, nearly 100% of the Federal Government's budget. They assigned each program a rating of effective, moderately effective, adequate, ineffective, or results not demonstrated. A number of efforts to improve the performance of duplicative programs flowed from this effort. For instance, the administration used assessment results as one factor in its decision to propose consolidation of 17 community and economic development programs. We also used the PART process to arrive at a common set of outcome measures with which to measure the government's job training programs. For a variety of reasons, the Obama administration is no longer using this tool to assess and improve programs. So what tools exist to do this today? A lot has been said about the Government Performance and Results Act Modernization Act, a promising framework for improving the coordination among like programs. If Congress takes an active role holding the executive branch accountable for its implementation, the law's requirements can be powerful incentives to improve coordination among duplicative programs. The budget released Monday does include 14 cross-cutting goals, as Senator Warner mentioned, and you can find those goals at www.goals.performance.gov. I think they're a mixed bag, but I think they could use your attention. Your feedback on those goals would be readily accepted by the administration. Getting programs in different agencies to agree on common goals and a coordinated approach for achieving them is hard. Agencies or programs with common goals often have completely different congressional authorizing and appropriations committees, a situation that enables stovepipes. They also have separate constituencies who will fight to preserve the status quo. While there are many barriers to interagency collaboration, technology provides enormous opportunity to overcome those barriers, especially social media and collaborative technology. The Federal Government is really only just beginning to capitalize on these tools to enhance collaboration. A number of other initiatives show promise. Program evaluation. The Obama administration is building on the Bush administration's effort to more rigorously evaluate programs across government, a very necessary step in order to discern what works in government. The Administrative Flexibility Initiative is also an important effort. The overlapping and duplicative programs tend to have exponentially more cumbersome and wasteful administrative requirements imposed on state and local governments. The administration has tasked agencies and OMB with inventorying those requirements and reducing them, which may seem like a minor effort, but could, when you combine them, really free up money that state and local governments can use to focus on outcomes. Improved coordination is easier said than done. Agency and program leadership are busy enough working within their own domain without having to be concerned with another's activities. Active congressional and presidential leadership and oversight can produce results sooner than what an organization may never produce. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Stiers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here, and as my colleague said, pleasure to be testifying with them. I think we are all trying to do the same thing, and I would also say all friends. So it's a really an honor to be here.
By the way, since you're all in the same academy, do we have a quorum here? Because each of you says you don't have this authority individually. Together, do we?
We could vote on the President's salary right now. We could make some savings right now.
And I think that Dan appropriately speaks for the whole Academy. But be that as it may, we do have violent agreement here, and I think a real question to ask is, since there's so much agreement, why isn't more happening? And I think that the execution imperative is fundamental here, and we have to focus, our primary attention on those execution questions. One way to do that is to look at what happened the last time that there was a major contraction in the government's budget during the 1990s. We have a process in government of repeating the past mistakes because we don't pay attention to what's happened before. So we actually did a report with Booz Allen called Smart Cuts, where we examined what occurred during the 1990s and drew a set of lessons that I believe have great application for today. And I'm just going to mention 5 of them. Obviously, we go in greater depth in the testimony. The first one is, and this is a conversation that likewise that's been held with the prior witnesses as well, and that is talent needs to be viewed as an asset, not a cost in government. The bottom line is that good government begins with good people. It's real easy to cut costs in cutting money out of the workforce, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're not really impacting mission in a way that we don't want. IBM did a great study of companies during the last downturn. And what they saw is that the companies under pressure were actually investing more in their people because they needed more out of them. And I think we need to take that attitude when we examine the federal workforce. It doesn't mean that they're not costs available, but we have to be real smart about how we do it. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're making better choices about what we're doing and not simply looking at across-the-board cuts, which again is the norm in what we saw during the 1990s. That penalizes the efficient and effective organizations when, in point of fact, if you want to save resources, you just have to do fewer things and do them well. But again, the tendency and the easy thing to do is just say we're going to cut across the board, and that doesn't end up actually giving us what we ultimately need. Third, we need to, and this is building off the comments that you made, Mr. Chairman, we really need to look over the long term. This is a long-haul process. My belief is one of the root causes of dysfunction in government is that we have a set of political leaders in the executive branch that are around on average for 18 months to 2 years. That means that they're incented to focus on policy development, crisis management, but not on the health of the organizations that they run, because frankly, they're not going to be around long enough either to have that impact or to actually pay the piper for problems that they create or don't solve. And so I think it's fundamental for us to have that long-term view. There are some great, good examples. Patent and Trademark Office is one of the ones that I love, where they went out, they had to change their physical site. They chose a building with a much smaller footprint. They decided we're going to change the culture. We're going to move to a telework environment. They wound up saving money on the physical plant that they had, they wound up producing better results in terms of their productivity, and they reduced their costs. We need to look for opportunities like that. Ask the question, whenever an agency is actually moving buildings, why don't we see that as a transformation opportunity? But again, looking at the long term. Fourth, we've got to measure the impact of our choices that we're making today. And again, what Robert, the work that he did on PART, I think is a fabulous example of things that we need to see more of. I present to the committee also the work that we've done at the partnership around the best places to work rankings. Again, a challenge in the public sector is you don't have financial metrics for performance frequently. And in the private sector where you do, smart companies look at employee attitudes because there's a strong correlation between those attitudes and ultimate performance. We should be using those numbers to tell us what's going on inside the Federal Government today, and Best Places allows us to do that. Fifth, coming to the question of reorganization, it is a reasonable strategy to use, but frankly, we ought to start with the talent issues. 9/11 Commission said it best. The quality of the people is more important than the quality of the wiring diagram. Important to see how those boxes play together, but if you don't solve the internal issues, frankly, the moving the boxes, as we've heard from a number of other folks, won't make any difference. In our written testimony, we offer 25 questions that we think are a good starting point in thinking about reorganization. And Mr. Chairman, I salute you for also the chart you put in. This is, again, a 9/11 Commission report recommendation. If we don't see this as a board of directors for the government, if we don't see the interrelationship, frankly, the executive branch won't work right. So pleasure to be here and look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for our first round. First question for all of you. In a reorganization, is a reorganization of the executive branch, we're talking about a significant change, not just one, if you will, cabinet position. Is there any way that that can be effective without Congress buying into it in a way in which, one, we support the change not just by a vote but by post-vote, particularly reorganizing to match the executive branch? I think Senator Warner said it pretty well. And as you mentioned, Mr. Steyer, the chart says it all. If we vote for a reorganization, don't we have to, in the House and the Senate, realign so that our committees match the new government reality?
I'll take a stab at that question, Mr. Chair.
You don't have to say yes or no, but yes would be good.
I think if you don't look at the organization of Congress in light of the changes that take place in executive branch organization, you risk running into the same problems of overlap and duplication, which you're actually trying to address within the executive branch organization itself. Can Congress as a body effectively conduct its oversight and authorizing and appropriating duties without changing? The answer is yes, but I think it's going to take a lot more effort. So I think that Congress is going to have to take a look at itself in terms of trying to align itself better with the reorganized executive branch.
So does that by definition beg the whole question of a reorg the way the President is talking about, give me authority and I'll loosely tell you what I'm going to do, or Hoover Commission, where you came up with 273 recommendations, most of which were accepted, but accepted over a long period of time with multiple interim steps?
Well, you can do a one-off here or one-off there in terms of executive branch organization.
Yeah, but Dr. Light said that's not an overhaul.
But you really need to do it in terms of an overarching strategy and within an architecture that makes sense as to what your ultimate goal would be.
Well, let me ask sort of the broadest question here. Senator Warner is a co-sponsor, or he actually has a companion bill for the Data Act. We're trying to make interoperative fundamentally how we communicate so that data in one place and the other doesn't take a team of people to try to match up on a one-up basis, but rather you can look at it transparently back and forth if you have the rights. Nice thought, nice idea. Clearly, I'm very dedicated to it. But let me ask a more fundamental question. OMB, which has, I'm told, 6 Senate-confirmed positions, is repeatedly, clearly ignored when they want to make fundamental changes in how Cabinet positions spend their money and do their work. Do we have a fundamental problem that even though there are 23 Cabinet-level positions, including the OMB director is considered a Cabinet level, do we have a fundamental problem in that back-office functions, sort of OPM, OMB, all the data questions, all the questions of how money is spent on not on what the Cabinet position does, but on the things that facilitate that. Those, in fact, are hierarchies that belong to Cabinet positions, and unless there is consensus, they can ignore, if you will, the office of the President by simply delaying. Is that a long but fundamental truth that every OMB director faces?
As having led a lot of interagency collaborations from OMB, I can tell you without question, there are going to be some who are really invested in the success of the enterprise, and you've got their buy-in, but there'll be a pocket, almost invariably, who oppose what you're trying to accomplish and want to protect their turf. And when it's been successful is when OMB and a lead agency and Congress are all joined at the hip and invested in the success of the enterprise. Examples include security clearance reform and the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act implementation. In both cases, Congress had virtually a seat at the table throughout the nitty-gritty of the implementation of both those initiatives, and they've proven more or less successful.
I'm going to ask just one exit question, if you will. Mr. Steyer, you used the PTO. The PTO currently has a backlog greater than it did before reorg. They've hired a lot more people. They now consume their entire budget, even without fee diversion. If this were a private enterprise, and basically because they charge the revenues that run them, wouldn't you give them less than an A?
I think that the PTO, again, and on the backlog side, first of all, I mean, clearly there's a 3-year backlog. I believe it's over 700,000 applications on the patent side. That's a massive problem. I think what David Kapos is doing is actually the right movement. I think he has gotten the backlog, my understanding, he's gotten the backlog down, and he is, I think, aligning his resources in a very smart way against their needs. And a good example of that is even around understanding how to use performance incentives to increase productivity. So they don't clearly, and I think Dave Kapos would be the first person to say that, deserve an A in terms of what they're producing today. But to your point about the time it takes to turn something around, my sense is, and you may have greater expertise in this than I do, but from what I can see, he's on the right track, but he's got a long distance to go.
And I'm a big fan of his. It's the only reason that, besides having my own patents and serving on judiciary, that I wanted to make sure we understood. He's got a big job and a long way to go, and his is a predominantly federal workforce that he's trying to get to be more productive, including the telecommuting, and including, by the way, they're citing a West Coast facility so they can recruit and retain people that right now just do not want to come to that little bitty building because it's in an area they don't want to live.
Right. No, absolutely, and that's critical. And I think the longer he stays in that job, that better the agency is going to be.
You heard it here. With that, we go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Mr. Steer, I gave a town hall meeting at the PTO headquarters you referred to, and I can confirm what you said. I saw a lot of energy and synergy. I mean, I think that it created something in terms of a dynamic that improved productivity and morale, and those are things definitely I would hope at some point we care about with respect to the federal workforce, not only at PTO but throughout the federal government. The President has proposed consolidating a number of international economic entities to try to achieve similar synergy and productivity. And I note a GAO report from last year that said these practices, meaning desirable practices, include leveraging physical and administrative resources, establishing compatible policies and procedures, monitoring collaboration, and reinforcing agency accountability for collaborative efforts through strategic or annual performance plans. From your point of view, does the President's proposal make sense in terms of similar synergy and productivity potential gains?
Look, I think there's no question but that we have a government that needs to be changed in many dramatic ways. I think the challenge here is that the idea almost is less important than the execution issues. And so that's why in my testimony I identified 25 questions that I think we really want to look for answers for before we start down this road. And again, thinking about historical example, if you look at the Department of Homeland Security, if you look at any major reorganization in the modern era, it is, after many, many years, at best, still a work in progress. So I think the answer to your question is that I think it's important for the President to be putting his marker down to say that we need to examine the form and shape of government. But what I would ask for and what I would suggest would make for a more successful ultimate resolution is that we look at a more comprehensive set of issues that include primarily some of the talent and culture issues that I think are fundamental ultimately to success in getting better productivity out of the government. I think you have to look at that holistically, and you have to build a time frame into it. So again, I think that whatever reorganization is imagined, we need to make sure there's continuity of attention and a leadership group that's around long enough to see that execution through.
Mr. Blair, one of the concerns I always have when I look at any government structure is the stovepipe structure and mentality. And again, sort of keying off the suggestions or the recommendations made by the President, when you go to some of our embassies overseas, there are lots of stovepipes, seemingly uncoordinated, and yet sharing a common mission in terms of trying to promote U.S. economic interest, investment, trade, and exports. And I just wonder if you might comment on that. How do we, if not this proposal, what, to try to overcome the stovepipe mentality to achieve efficiencies and productivity gains that we desperately need?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the question. There are different approaches you could take to attack that stovepiping that you identified, and one of them that's outlined in my testimony is it's an approach called smart lean government. This approach was brought to the Academy by some of its fellows, and we've been working with an outside group at refining this, but fundamentally what it does is takes a holistic approach at looking at government across the spectrum, not at a department or an agency, but by looking at the actual program that's being delivered. And so one of the things that I talked about was, take for instance international trade. It's just not one agency, we have a series of agencies. And look at the ultimate service or product or program that's being delivered, and how is the most effective way of getting that to the customer. Is there overlap and duplication? Are multiple departments involved? If so, why? GAO came out with a report last year that highlighted potential overlap and duplication in a whole host of programs. Sometimes that duplication is necessary and intentional. Sometimes you want those belts and suspenders in order to prevent a program failure. But this approach would take a look at it across the government spectrum and say, what's the most effective way of delivery to the customer? Usually the customer doesn't care who delivers it so much as it's done well and that it meets his or her or their company or industry's needs. So that's one approach that could be taken.
And Mr. Shea, if I had a little more time, I might ask you to elaborate a little bit. You made a very interesting point in terms of expanding evaluations as a tool. I wonder if you might just elaborate on that as my last question.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. In order to find out whether our programs are working, it's necessary to conduct a scientific experiment, basically isolating what we're doing from other factors so you can say without a shadow of a doubt what we're doing is working. Simple performance measurement is a very good indicator, but it often disguises other factors that are impacting the performance outside of what we're doing. The Department of Education has a large investment through the Institute of Education Sciences to really figure out what's impacting student outcomes throughout the country, and they're building a body of evidence that helps them invest better in more effective practices. This is being expanded throughout government on a relatively small scale, but a kernel of information about an effective practice is gold if you can really use it to scale up and impact outcomes that, frankly, we've been working on for centuries and haven't made a dent.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Listening to senators earlier, I was interested to hear a lot of violent agreement, as you've mentioned, from two senators in a body that has extremely violent disagreement on actually doing something. And I'm reminded that we're coming up on the third anniversary of the stimulus that expanded government, that really did not produce an economy that would grow. I look at a little card here that I have that lists a number of things to deal with regulatory barriers that come from government, and a significant number of bills that we've passed, including the REINS Act and other regulatory accountability for reforms that still sit in the Senate, not acted upon. So while I'm not asking you as a panel of senators on how we should accomplish this, I have appreciated some of the statements that you have made in your opening remarks. Dr. Light, I was raised in the home of a machinist who was also extreme conservative and always thought that he could rebuild his cars and engines much better and more efficiently than taking it to a mechanic. And so in the grease pit that he built in our family garage, I watched him do that and then became a gearhead myself and have had engines, both light tune-ups as well as rebuilds, taking the whole engine out of the car as well when I had to. I know also that in process of grinding valves, that's a fine process, taken carefully, as opposed to wrenching out the bottom end of an engine and taking out the crankshaft and replacing it. I was interested in your background on that as you discussed what needs to be done with bureaucracy. And so I'd like to ask you if you would discuss a bit further and in detail your proposals to overhaul the bureaucracy, including removing engine parts as necessary.
Well, I know how to tune and set the timing on a 57 Chevy, but that's not how we do it now, is it?
That's right. We don't have the points anymore.
You know, I think to continue this metaphor, the first thing you do is drain the oil and clean out the sludge, and that's something we got to do. I agree with my colleagues that it's difficult, and there's a lot of conversation about rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic, but we've got a real opportunity here. We've got about 50% of the federal workforce moving towards retirement, and that can be seen as a problem, or that can be seen as an opportunity. We've got a lot of opportunity here to take a look at what we've got, and instead of downsizing through attrition at the bottom or reductions in force, we can take a look at jobs and not fill them as they've been exited. We can take a look at the structure of government and reorganize, but we're going to have to go big. We're going to have to take a look at the whole structure. And this opportunity is going to slip through our fingers, and 10 years from now, we're going to have the same government that we have right now. I'm all in favor of patience, but when an opportunity like this comes along, you take advantage of it. Now, how do we do that? I'm not wild about another Hoover Commission. I'm not sure we could do it with the current structure of Congress, and I'm not sure that the President could relay the reorganization plans. I do like the idea of creating some sort of government reform trust modeled on the Resolution Trust Corporation, to which we would give responsibility for collecting the delinquent taxes, collecting the bad loans, collecting and dealing liquidating the useless property that we have and collecting the money from doing so. I mean, we've got some cherry picking that we can do that can yield big dollar returns if we just invest in it and give somebody the authority to do it. And then we've got to actually delayer the government. We've got to take some things off and streamline the block, if you will.
Well, let me follow up on that and ask maybe across the panel if you'd care to comment. Does the Constitution, and as one witness in a hearing last week said, the constitutional niceties, I disagree with that. I think there's some authority in the Constitution. Does that come into play in dealing with the size of government, in your minds?
Well, I'll just quickly say that the Constitution is quite clear that the executive is to faithfully execute the laws. And Hamilton, a particular proponent of a well-functioning government, argued that the jarrings of parties that we see on Capitol Hill, the intense conflict, is important for protecting the public from tyranny. But once the laws are passed, the President is to execute, period. End of story. And the President has authorities properly checked by this institution, and we can figure out ways to get this done and get it done in a timely fashion without wasting this opportunity that we have. We can figure this out. You are capable of doing it, and you've done it already. So, I mean, I think it's possible.
The gentleman's time has expired.
One comment I would have on that is that we don't, it would be interesting to see what our founders would think about our Federal Government today. And to that end, and maybe in some shameless self—
As long as we had an EMT close to them.
Well, what I was going to mention is that, and maybe this may be shameless self-promotion on part of the Academy, but we are going to be looking at hosting a seminar on this in a couple of months. And we're looking at what the Federalist Papers and others said at the time of the founders, and looking at and comparing and contrasting that today. So I think that will be a good debate, and I think that I'll be able to more fully answer your question after hearing from our panelists on that. But we have a very fundamental problem today that we can't deliver, or we have a hard time delivering, on the products and services that government is supposed to be delivering on. And we're not doing it as efficiently and effectively as we have to. We have a pending sequestration that's hanging over everyone's heads, and something needs to be done. And it's going to take leadership. It's going to take executive leadership, congressional leadership, working together and working across the aisle. But if it's done by one side or another, or the other side, and it's done to the other side, you're not going to build together that critical mass that's necessary to shepherd those reforms through. We can look back through history, like over the last 10 to 15 years, and seeing reforms, if it's not been in personnel, in health care, et cetera, that didn't have that strong bipartisan, bicameral support. And if you don't have that, when the sides switch, where are the promoters and where are the people who are the stakeholders in that? And so what I would urge, this committee is poised and primed to serve that function, to come up with a plan, to maybe not the plan itself, but to direct an organization or to come up with the parameters for what a reorganized Federal Government should look like. Your counterpart in the Senate is equipped to do the same thing, and that you're at a point in history when this can be done, and that the American people are depending on you. They're depending on the Congress. They're depending on the executive branch. They want to see everyone join together at least to do what is good and in the best interest of the American people. And so to that effect, I think that this committee has a rare opportunity to make that happen.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to take a stab at building on the violent agreement among you to see if we can model it for this committee. Often there is needless division in this committee, and I wonder if this might not be the time when I listen to your testimony to draw out something of what the committee has done with what the President proposes to do. And by the way, watch out for your looking at the framers. The framers were so wise. The framers knew what they didn't know and what they did know. And one thing the framers could not have envisioned is a global economy, industrial revolution, and the technical revolution that we're trying to go through. So the last thing they did was to try to reorganize the government. That's up to us. The committee has voted to reduce the size of government. I'm not sure where this has gone in the House floor, but by 2015, by 10%, some across-the-board figure. Now, the President now wants to reorganize the government. My only experience with this kind of massive reorganization comes from having served on the board of 3 Fortune 500 companies. And I must tell you that it is only out of that experience that I can counter my inherent hostility to fast track, because I can tell you that no CEO in a Fortune 500 companies would have done anything but put the plan before the Board of Directors, and that's it. In this, and what the President faces is 400 CEOs or 400 and some CEOs who want to get into the act of reorganizing the government, so I guess that drives him to fast track, and we always hate it. But let me tell you what's already happened. For decades now, we've had a base closure commission. And look, I've lost the base. They have another one coming up. We hate it. They survive. This very committee has just approved a BRAC-type bill to allow for the consolidation and disposal of property. A bill from another committee, a similar bill, went to the floor last week, BRAC-type, civilian BRAC-type bill for agencies, so you can dispose of or consolidate some of this excess property held by a number of agencies, passed in the House. Okay. So what we have before us now is, the committee uses the word obesity, meaning some are concerned with the number of employees, despite figures showing a quite remarkable and steady decline in the number of employees. When you listen to Senator Warner's testimony, it suggests that our problem has not been so much people as duplication of programs. Indeed, Senator Warner himself, in listing his examples, didn't point to agencies. He pointed to programs. This one does the this for the poor children, and so does that one. And there are 10 agencies that do it. So my question is, with members of Congress wanting to reduce the federal workforce further right now, and with the President wanting to reorganize the workforce, isn't this a rational time? Isn't this a time to bring the two together rationally, so that, for example, instead of a 10% cut across the board, you may, with reorganization, eliminate whole programs altogether, and therefore accomplish what you want, perhaps with the same amount of funding in a more rational way. I think you, Dr. Light, talked about streamlining and delayering. Well, you don't do either with a 10% across the board cut. You do what happened when I was at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where I was chair. We did the attrition and so forth, but if there were too few lawyers, we would have to fill those positions anyway, because they were vital to what the agency did. So I'd like to know whether I'd like to hear from all four of you, whether you think the President's desire to reorganize and the committee's desire to cut employees, in fact, could come together if the President were given this authority, which I hate, which I'm trying to fight against my own bias to find what is the right way to go.
First of all, it's a delight to be back testifying before you. It's nice to see you again. Let me say that I'm violently opposed to the attrition-based downsizing. I don't think it's going to work. And in fact, oftentimes you hear people who advocate the downsizing, which hits the bottom layer of government with a tsunami force while insulating the higher levels of government from much turnover at all. So we hear people saying we ought to cut the workforce, but incidentally, PTO has that backlog, and SSA has a backlog, and the Veterans Administration has a backlog, and the backlogs grow and grow and grow because these downsizings, and the Clinton administration did this too, these downsizings whack off the bottom of government because the quit rates, the separation rates are much higher, and Max Stier has documented the separation rates in the first 5 years of service. Now, if we start looking at the jobs that the baby boomers are vacating at the middle and higher levels, we can get some reductions in force there. But we should take the dollars, I believe, that we save from those reductions in force and hire more people on the front line. You might end up.
Well, can you do that without reorganization?
You can do it without reorganization, but it's a multiplier effect on reorganization. You might end up with the same number of Federal employees, but they'd be at a different level, and there'd be a different cost. You'd have more inspectors, you'd have more disability review, you'd have more people looking at those patent and trademark applications. You'd have a better working government. And you wouldn't have to do it through an attrition-based downsizing that would reduce the number of people who are actually delivering the goods and services. I understand the point of the effort, but I don't think it works the way people think it will.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The Chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Light, you proposed a $1 trillion cut in Federal spending last July, and there's a lot of areas that you cut from. Can you focus for a minute on why the Federal management has 18 layers of I guess, management, and you would like to reduce that number to 6? Why does the government currently have so many management layers, and how does that impact its efficiency?
The management layers exist for a simple reason. The Federal Government pays exactly no price for creating new layers. Every business in America pays a price in lost productivity, lost clarity of communication when it creates a new layer of management. So does Congress, which has created more and more layers in the Office of Management and Budget and so forth. And universities. You want to see a paragon of layering, you ought to take a look at university hierarchies. It's when you pay a price for creating a layer that you reduce the creation of layers. That's it. And we've allowed them to be established, and we allow them to spread. I counted 64 layers between the top of the departments on average and the bottom of just the administrator compartment. I mean, it's because we don't pay a price for it, and we've used it during pay freezes, and we've used it during hiring freezes. We've used the creation of layers to get our people moved up. It's often by accident, and we just don't do much about it.
Do you know what the total number of Federal employees are, the private contractors, Federal employees like ourselves, postal, veterans? Do you know what the total number is?
The estimated number I would use is 14 million. 14
million.
And then, I mean, that includes some number. I mean, that includes the contractors, the military, the Postal Service, the quasi-governments, you know, the full-time equivalent feds, the full-time equivalent contractors.
I think Chairman Issa asked Senator Warren what would be the ideal workforce, and he gave an answer that seems acceptable, whatever is appropriate to do a good job. And I think he went on to say that we don't really even know how many people work for us. And that's a problem. I ran a medical practice for 20 years, and I've had from 4 to 5 employees, and I can say down to probably 15 minutes a day, I know what each one of those employees does. And the Federal Government, when we don't even know what these people are doing, that seems like a big problem. And a good example this year on our MRA accounts for all of the members, we were tasked with reducing that number by 5% in 2011. And in 2012, we're tasked with reducing that by 6%. So we've seen a 10% cut in 2 years. And the reason we're successful at getting that done is because I was told when I came to Congress that I had this budget to manage my staff, and if I went over budget, that money came out of my pocket. So guess what? We're meeting those levels. How can we transform that into a bigger approach with government and get better accountability?
Well, I mean, we know everything possible about Federal employees once they're on the payroll, almost to their shoe size. We know nothing about the number of contract employees. Every time I roll out these estimates, which are pretty solid, but, you know, they're estimates, the Service Contractor Association says, you know, these are terrible estimates. They're just estimates. They're overblown. And I'll always say back to them, I get phone calls from my colleague over there, and I'll always say back, you know, Stan, that's a good point, but what's your number? And he'll say, we don't have one, and we don't want to get one, and we don't have to get one. We don't have to tell you how many people we employ. So we do not extract from the contract community or the grant community any data on what gets paid. The Project on Government Oversight just released a report comparing contract costs by job classification code in the contractor community, the private sector, and the Federal community. And Feds are overpaid somewhat in many categories to private employees.
Is it like 70,000 to 50,000 on average? Is that the gap between
But when you go to the
federal and private?
contractor community, the contractors are vastly overpaid compared to the Federal employees.
One other point. I think I've heard from Ed and Workforce, we had a hearing, and 98.5% of government employees are retained once they join the government workforce. Have you ever heard of that type of retention rate of employees in any other private sector industry?
You know, the turnover rate has to be somewhere between 0 and 5% to get that fresh blood. I mean, I'd rely on Max here, my colleague Max, to give you something on that.
Okay. Actually, I did want to get to some of your thoughts on the unpaid tax liability that the IRS has identified, about $300 billion per year. But my time has expired, and so I will yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Light, you just said something that was very interesting. You said the contractors are paid more than the Federal employees. Is that right?
Absolutely correct, according to the Project on Government Oversight. And 33 of the 34 job classifications they studied, I think it was 34, contractors were overpaid. No, not overpaid, were paid more. You know, I shouldn't have let that word slip.
And the Federal government is spending over $500 billion on Federal contracts. We keep hearing about proposals to cut Federal employees. However, you recommended in your testimony that the acquisition workforce should be increased to strengthen oversight. Now, why is it so important to increase the number of employees focused on acquisition oversight?
We need to know what's happening out there in that 40% of contracts that are sole sourced, non-competed. We have a vast increase in the number of bundled contracts, which are nests of contractors, sub and sub and sub. We don't know what's going on in there. And the acquisition workforce has remained pretty steady, a little bit lower now, at sort of low 60,000s since 1990. We just got to take a look inside those nests, those sole source contracts. That's what the Shea Commission has done on Iraq wartime contracting. I mean, you start looking inside these nests and you see these conflicts of interest and problems monitoring what's going on. We have to have more people with the skills, and this goes to Max Steyer's point. We've got to have a stronger acquisitions workforce, and we cannot rely on contractors to write our RFPs, which happens in many agencies.
Well, you know, we had an experience with that with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard in the Deep Water Project, they had the private contractors pretty much write the contract.
Right.
And we now have sitting in Baltimore 8 ships that they bought pretty much that don't float because they did not have a decent acquisitions department. So they left it up to the private contractors, and they were buying radar systems that were supposed to cover 360 degrees that covered 180 degrees. That's what the private, we lost millions upon millions of dollars in that deep water project.
Well, we have primes on some of these bundled contractors that are subs to other primes on other contracts who are subs on their contracts. You see what I mean? I mean, you've got like this nest of potential conflict of interest across the contract community, but we can't see it. It's not transparent at all.
So it's so big that it's like a monster that we can't control. But yet and still we are letting go a lot of Federal employees. And it seems that a lot of people have this impression that these Federal employees are making a whole lot of money. And a lot of them work right here on the Hill, and they're not making but so much money. But yet and still we're chopping and freezing their pay. It's very interesting.
Well, I don't want to help you set your oversight agenda, but we ought to take a look at the implementation of the Service Contractor Act of 1965 in terms of what the bottom level of the contractor industry is paying its workers. They are supposed to be paying a small premium for health insurance and other benefits if they are not providing those directly, and there's absolutely no evidence that goes on. I mean, we just need to understand more about what we're spending. Could we use fewer contract employees? We can't answer the question until we know how many there are.
So let me make sure I understand what you just alluded to, and I know you didn't come to a conclusion. You asked it, sort of put it out there as a question. But are you thinking that one of the questions that need to be asked is when these contracts are then given, awarded to the private contractors, work that would have normally been done by federal workers, and they are supposedly for a lower amount, I guess, but in the end, a lot of times the benefits that would flow to the employees of those contractors are not at all comparable to what they would get if they, as a federal employee. Is that
right? Right. What happens is that we save money on the frontline delivery in the short term, but we have an intergenerational cost transfer 30, 40 years down the line. If you take in a worker at 22 and do not provide a compensation package, you do not provide any kind of pension support, 40, 50 years later, they are going to come back to us for supplemental security income. The cost of not providing compensation at the bottom of the contract workforce eventually catches up to us, and of course the spread between the top and the bottom is also something worth looking at. We increased this committee led the effort to increase the President's salary to $400,000 starting in 2001, and we thought that might lift the top of the Federal salary structure to eliminate compensation for the SES. It did a little, but we still have work to do on that to see what the spreads are across the sectors.
All right, I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to do a very quick follow-up. And Dr. Light, I'm not sure I understand the whole idea that if you pay less now, you're automatically going to have this tail. That would beg the idea that Greece had the right idea, lock, stock, and barrel, that, a job for life and guaranteed retirement at 50 and so on is the right answer.
Good point.
But I won't go there. I will go to one area because this committee, Mr. Cummings is on both, but this committee looked deeply into deep water, and what we found was that the Navy had all the assets necessary to deliver those 8 ships properly. And a classic example, I'd like your comment on it, was the Coast Guard didn't know how to build major ships at sea. The Navy does it for a living. The Coast Guard decided to do it itself without the resources. So my question to you is, if you, rather than say you've got to develop the Coast Guard to have the ability to build what is essentially identical ships to what the Navy builds every day, how do we change government so that, quite frankly, the Coast Guard gets told, sorry, you're just not the best to buy your own ship in this case. We'll give you a seat at the table, but the Navy is going to procure it. How do we make that change to where that same dumb contract doesn't happen again that gives us ships that break in half in less than 20 years? Mr. Stiers, you look like you're anxious to answer.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and I'm quite interested in what Dr. Light is going to respond. I will throw in one thought, and that is that my view is that if we increased mobility amongst the leadership in government, that would actually help address, not fully address, but it would help address the issue you're describing.
Goldwater Nichols for the non-defense area.
Absolutely, and frankly, with DOD, there's a lot of expertise in DOD. Goldwater Nichols has worked quite substantially to increase integration across the services, but you don't see a lot of integration with DOD and the civilian agencies. And frankly,
or even DOD civilians.
That is correct, absolutely. And it's 92% of the SES come from within government, 4 out of 5 from within the same agency. Once they're actually in the SES, only 8% move agencies. We're putting out a report on this at the end of the month. But that, I think, you move people around, you create relationships, you have people understand that there's knowledge in other places, and they know who to call. And that's the kind of thing that I think would have dramatic impact.
So I see general consensus on that. Let me follow up with one more thing. This committee is very partisan sometimes on Federal workforce. I came out of San Diego, California, where we had a formal commission process for outsourcing versus insourcing. We had a system in which you could insource if you could prove you could do it cheaper. You could keep a contract if you could prove that you were nearly competitive to an outsource, et cetera, et cetera. Do we need to have a refinement in that type of analysis so that, in fact, the Federal workforce broadly would essentially get the right to, if they could beat the full-time equivalent of a contractor and provide the same flexibility, they could, in a sense, bid for it, so that we wouldn't have this big question of, are we paying for an outsource greater, and I appreciate, Dr. Light, your concept on the paying less, but in some cases we pay more. The best example that I see every day is what we're paying, or know of every day. Right now in Iraq, the people who replaced our men and women in uniform are costing us 3 and 4 times as much as the uniformed people they replace. And I mean, not just, I mean, you know, it's $250,000 per security person, and no matter how you load our active duty military, you don't get to that number. Is there a responsibility and a possibility that we could create the kind of flexibility so the question of what we used to call bill or buy in the private sector, but bill or buy in the sense of refining the Federal workforce? And if we do so, do we need to have a level of flexibility of the Federal workforce that goes with that? And I'd go right down the line.
San Diego was also a pioneer in public nonprofit and private competition on the welfare front. You know, very celebrated experiment out there. What we really have to do, I think, is take a good hard look at Budget Circular A76, which defines the basic terms for contracting out. It was revised when?
2003. It was.
I think we really need to take a good hard look at how it's been implemented and how we define this term inherently.
So after we determined that it failed, because we saw outsourcing for greater cost under President Bush at times, clearly, right. And now we see insourcing in which they tap the contractor employee on the shoulder and say, we're going to be insourcing, would you like a pay raise? I mean, we've clearly had an ignoring of these kinds of considerations under both, at least the 2 presidents I've served under.
Correct.
Mr. Blair?
Well, I was going to interject.
So much for briefly, by the way, but please, that was my last question.
It's really the question of what's inherently governmental. And if the job is inherently governmental, it should not be contracted out. And if the job is not inherently governmental, then there is a fair question of why would you have a Federal employee performing that function when it's not inherently governmental. So maybe the issue, the more fundamental issue.
But isn't the answer the lowest cost delivery of what the government has determined shall be delivered on behalf of the government? And I say that because the question of inherently governmental, I can come up with reasons, for example, that a patent examiner is inherently governmental. On the other hand, I look and say, well, look, if the quality of the patent is properly reviewed and the final decision is a government decision, well, then the government made its inherently governmental decision, which was only the very last step, which was the awarding. So I could go through and have that argument time and time again, but inherently governmental is hard to decide, and we can each have our own. Once you decide the government shall deliver, and San Diego is, Dr. Light, one of my favorite examples, we made a decision that maybe the YMCA was better, maybe the Beth Israel was better. We went through whole processes of secular and religious groups, and it was always a question of we, the government, are paying for it, we take responsibility, and we want the highest quality delivered at the best value, if you will, not just price. And that concept allowed us to flow in and out, and by the way, take away contracts even from the most sympathetic groups if they weren't delivering the best value. How do we get to defining that, not with a circular, but with something that we can then check and recheck and recheck? Because otherwise, how do we reduce the total cost of delivery and in fact guarantee that quality, fully paid for service is delivered? Mr. Shea? And I thank the ranking member. I know this has gone longer than I planned.
Yes, sir. During the Bush administration, we had a program called competitive sourcing, with which you're familiar. It was governed by A76. A76 sets as a target the completion of a competition within 2 to 4 years. So in a bureaucracy, that's a goal. You want to shoot for that 4 years. So they were all more complicated and time-consuming than you wanted them to be. But the vast majority of these competitions resulted in a victory by the in-house employees. But a majority of cases, you performed the same function more professionally and with a smaller workforce. Now,
right. In other words, it caused the Federal workforce to reconcile their own shortcomings and get better.
Absolutely. I'll never forget the looks on the faces of employees when we concluded a competition at OMB. We were going to get more professional staff, while this function we were studying was going to get more professional but smaller. And folks who generally opposed this were delighted at the outcome. That suggests that we could have done a much better job communicating it on the front end, because it does impact morale when you're going into this. We learned a lot from that process that I think would benefit future similar efforts.
Mr. Steyer, you have the last word.
I'm just going to say thank you.
You're most welcome. You have the ranking members recognized.
Just to follow up on the Chairman's questions, Mr. Shea, when you were talking about the comparisons between the government and private contractors, where does the piece that I was talking to Dr. Light about, let's say, for example, we've got a private contractor that is offering X benefits, and those benefits don't, say, even compare to what the government is offering. How does that play into that? You follow me?
Yes.
Because it's certainly going to be cheaper. I mean, you would think it would be cheaper because I get complaints from people who, in my district, who say that they're sitting next to people who may be under a contract doing basically the same work, but in some instances not getting the benefits that they're getting. You follow me?
Let me just say that I'm very proud of the benefits we offer our employees at Grant Thornton. And I think, I'm not sure.
I mean, in other words, how do you
do an apples-to-apples comparison?
That's right. That's exactly right.
And I'm not sure exactly the parameters of H76 in that regard, but I think within some limitations, what you're saying is the full cost of the government and the bill the government pays a contractor. And I think there are some requirements that Dr. Light mentioned about minimum benefits you pay, but I think generally that is taken into account when you're looking at the bottom line cost that the government is paying the contractor versus the fully loaded cost that you're paying an employee. And that's what takes the time, frankly, in the competitions. You're trying to make sure that the cost estimates of each, the in-house team and the contractor, are fairly compared.
Mr. John, did you have a comment on that?
I would just add that it's also, I think, important to look at the cost also of the acquisition process. And one of the, and I say this with some hesitation only because I haven't been able to verify the data, but I was told just yesterday by somebody in the IT world that the average cost of the acquisition in the government was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of the total cost of the package, including implementation, in the government space, in the public sector space, whereas a reasonable average in the private sector was around 12% or 12.5%. And I think that, again, if we're looking at cost savings, it's not simply, we got to look at the process itself, and it's the direct costs that are associated there, but frankly, we also do a very poor job of engaging the contractor community in helping identify the right design according to clear requirements. So there's a complex set of issues that if you try to really take this on, I think are worth examining, in which I do believe that there are enormous efficiencies that are available to us. And the last piece, I would say, we are missing inside government, not just the acquisition workforce folks that we need, but Mr. Chairman, to your point, at the end of the day, what we look for in our government is the ultimate oversight to say that the public good is being looked after in the appropriate fashion. We don't have the right talent today internally to make those decisions, and that's a real problem.
And how do you suggest we have it?
And I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm using up your time. I think the starting point really is understanding what our priorities are, because, again, I think there isn't clarity associated with that, and then examining what critical skills that we actually need to achieve those priorities. And that this is something that I think needs to take place not just within agencies, but holistically as well. But it is a real challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. And as I said in the beginning, we'd like to have you, as your thoughts go on for the next several days, we'll hold the record open for 5 days so that you can, as we like to say, revise and extend. And with that, we stand adjourned.